welcome to reform thinking. So what if the hardest, the most agonizing moments of your life were not punishments from an angry judge, but the precise opposite?
Right. Yep.
Like, what if a pain-free life is actually the most terrifying thing that could happen to you? Because usually when we talk about diagnosing a problem, we expect precision. Think about engineering or medicine. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen. The doctor just points at it and says, there is the fracture.
Yeah, it is binary. The bone is broken or the bone is not broken. It's a clean, objective fact that anyone can see, and there is a prescribed method for fixing it.
And there is a certain comfort in that visual evidence. We like things to be visible. We like things to be categorized neatly in a file folder. We want a clear cause and a clear effect.
Sure, humans love cause and effect.
Right. But then you step into the world of personal suffering. You face a massive life hurdle, a sudden financial collapse, a health crisis, or even just a long string of brutal everyday frustrations. Suddenly, that X-ray machine is broken. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
It is incredibly murky.
When things go wrong in life, human beings instinctively try to diagnose the reason why. We desperately want to know the cause of the pain so we can make it stop. So today, we're doing a deep dive into an 1855 sermon by Charles Spurgeon titled Chastisement, based on the text of Hebrews chapter 12, verse 5. The mission of this conversation is to unpack a paradigm-shifting way to look at personal suffering, hardship, and divine discipline.
Yeah, and this specific text completely rewrites the diagnostic manual we normally use for our own pain. It takes the conventional assumptions we hold about why bad things happen and, well, flips them completely upside down. It forces us to look at our wounds through a completely different lens.
And if you are listening to this right now and you are currently lying in a hospital bed, or you are staring at a stack of past due bills, or you are dealing with the crushing weight of a relationship falling apart, you might be thinking this is all going to be, academic theory.
Right, just theological jargon.
Yeah, but this framework provides a shocking perspective. It separates punitive anger from loving correction. It changes the entire way you look at the jagged lines on your own life's X-ray. So let's start right at the base. Before we can talk about how to react to suffering, we have to understand what the suffering actually is. Let's look at the core theological distinction that sets up this entire 1855 sermon.
The entire sermon hinges on a very specific structural difference between a courtroom and a living room. Spurgeon lays out this opening thesis, and it's massive. He says a believer is never punished for their sins in a judicial sense. Never.
Never. That is a strong word.
It is absolute. And the logic here is based entirely on the concept of substitute atonement. Christ already endured the full penalty as a substitute for the believer. Therefore, neither the justice nor the love of God can ever exact again a payment that Christ has already made.
Let's slow down and really pull this apart, because the word punished is incredibly loaded. People use it casually all the time.
Oh, constantly.
Right. Someone stubs their toe and says, well, the universe is punishing me for being late. But in this theological context, punishment has a very strict judicial definition. What does a courtroom actually require when a crime is committed?
Well, in a judicial system, punishment is exacted by a judge. The judge has a singular role. The judge is upholding the law, avenging justice, and maintaining the dignity of the commands that were broken.
Right.
The punishment is applied in wrath, or at least in cold, objective anger against a crime. I mean, a judge does not send someone to prison to help them self-actualize. The judge sends them to prison because a debt to society must be paid. Justice demands satisfaction.
So in this framework, the believer is standing in a courtroom. The crimes, the sins, are massive. The judge is perfectly just, which means the judge cannot just wave a hand and say, do not worry about it, you are free to go. A just judge must demand payment.
Precisely. If a judge lets a guilty person walk free without any payment for the crime, that judge is corrupt. So payment must be made, but the core tenet of this theology is that the payment was already made by a substitute. Christ steps into the courtroom, takes the penalty, and absorbs the judicial wrath. Once that transaction is complete, the courtroom phase is over. The debt is zero.
Which means justice cannot demand two payments for the same crime. If the debt is paid, the judge has no legal right to demand a second payment from the believer.
That is the crucial theological linchpin. Spurgeon says the believer is no longer in that courtroom at all. The gavel has fallen, the case is closed, and the believer walks out the door. But they do not just walk out into a void, they step into a new relationship. That of a child to a parent. They walk out of the courtroom and into the living room. So believers do not face punishment from a judge, they face chastisement from a parent.
Okay, so the suffering itself might look the exact same from the outside,
Yeah.
right? If a person loses their job, the bank account drains to zero, and the stress is keeping them awake at night, the physical and emotional reality is identical.
That is where the friction happens in our minds. The suffering might feel identical in intensity. A person who is being judicially punished and a person who is being chastised as a child might endure the exact same amount of physical or emotional pain in this life. A broken leg hurts just as much whether you are a criminal or a beloved child.
Right. Pain is pain.
Yeah. But the difference lies entirely in two things: the mind of the punisher and the relationship to the person.
The mind of the punisher. That is a fascinating phrase. What is happening in the mind of the judge versus the mind of the parent?
Punishment is for God's justice and glory. Chastisement is for the believer's profit. Punishment is applied in wrath, to destroy or to penalize. Chastisement is applied in love, to correct and to heal. Spurgeon uses this incredibly vivid imagery to drive the point home. He says that before the rod of correction is laid on the believer's back, it has been baptized in deep affection.
Baptized in deep affection. That is a striking image. It suggests premeditation, too. The parent does not just fly off the handle and swing wildly.
No, not at all.
The rod is carefully prepared. It is dipped in affection before it ever makes contact. But I want to push back on this on behalf of someone listening right now.
Yeah.
Let us bring this out of 19th century theological language and into the real world.
Okay, let's do it.
If a severe illness or a sudden financial collapse feels precisely the same whether we call it punishment or chastisement, how does changing the label actually help a person lying in a hospital bed? If the pain is a level 10 either way, does the vocabulary really matter? Are we just playing word games with suffering?
It is not a word game at all. It matters immensely because of the psychological weight of guilt. Think about what happens in the human mind when severe suffering hits. The immediate default setting for almost everyone is, God is paying me back for my sins. God is finally angry with me for that thing I did 10 years ago.
Right, that immediate self-blame.
Yes, and that specific thought produces absolute despair. It makes you want to hide.
Like a criminal trying to hide from the judge.
You duck your head, you avoid eye contact, you hope the judge does not look too closely at your file. You are terrified. Right. And fear paralyzes you. But if you remove that idea entirely, if you establish that God cannot be punishing you in wrath because that wrath was already poured out on Christ in the courtroom, then the despair evaporates. You are freed from the crushing weight of punitive guilt. Instead of cowering from a judge's wrath, you look up at a parent's face.
So even if the parent's face looks stern, there is no hatred behind it.
Spot on. Spurgeon makes the point that even if God's brow seems ruffled, there is no hot displeasure in his heart toward the believer. Removing the fear of wrath completely changes the patient's posture in that hospital bed. Instead of saying, I am being destroyed because I am hated, the patient says, I am being corrected because I am loved. Therefore, there must be a lesson here, there must be a profit. You stop running away from the pain and you start looking for the purpose inside of it.
That shift from hiding to learning is huge. It takes the suffering from being a random act of cosmic cruelty and turns it into an intentional surgical procedure. But that brings us to a massive practical problem. Once we accept that this suffering is loving discipline, that it is the rod of the covenant baptized in affection, we still have to figure out how to handle the actual pain.
Which is not easy.
Not at all. And Spurgeon warns that human beings are terrible at handling this correctly. We tend to swerve wildly out of control. He warns of two opposite dangerous reactions. We have to steer past two extremes.
Yes. Spurgeon introduces this fascinating concept regarding human failure. He says, evils always hunt in couples, sins always go in a leash.
Sins always go in a leash. That phrasing paints such a vivid picture. I see two vicious dogs chained together, pulling you in opposite directions. You try to get away from one, and the other one bites you.
That is the dynamic he is describing. When facing the rod of chastisement, there are two primary dangers pulling at you. The first is despising the rod, which is rooted in human pride. The second is fainting under the rod, which is rooted in despair. Spurgeon compares this to steering a ship between a rock on one side and a whirlpool on the other, Scylla and Charybdis from ancient classical mythology.
It makes me think of walking a narrow mountain pass.
What?
You have a sheer, solid rock wall going straight up on your left and a sheer drop-off into a canyon on your right. Falling off the left side, smashing into the rock of pride, is just as lethal as falling off the right side into the canyon of despair.
Exactly.
But why is it so incredibly difficult for human nature to just stay in the middle? Why do we instinctively gravitate toward these extremes the second we are put under pressure?
Well, when pressure is applied, our natural defense mechanisms kick in, and defense mechanisms are rarely balanced. We tend to overcorrect. If we feel threatened by the pain, our ego takes over. We puff out our chests, we grit our teeth, and we try to prove our self-reliance. We say, I can handle this. I do not need to learn anything from this. This cannot break me. That is despising the rod. We harden ourselves against the lesson.
And the opposite reaction.
Conversely, we feel the immense weight of the pressure, and we completely collapse. We refuse to move. We say, I am totally crushed. I can do nothing. This is the end of the world. We let the pain completely define our identity. That is fainting. We lose all hope and start trying to walk the path.
If we look at modern culture, this dynamic feels highly relevant. It seems like modern society actively pushes us toward these two specific extremes. On one hand, you have this relentless demand to loudly project resilience.
Oh, the hustle culture mindset.
Yeah, the idea that you must immediately conquer every setback, turn your trauma into a triumph by Tuesday morning, and never show a single moment of weakness. No days off, grind through the pain. That is essentially despising the rod. It is refusing to sit still under the correction and actually feel the weight of it.
And on the other hand, you have a growing cultural trend that encourages total victimization. If you face a hardship, the message is sometimes that you are permanently broken, that the world is entirely against you, and you are therefore exempt from any further exertion, responsibility, or growth. You just sit in the mud and declare yourself a victim of circumstances.
Right.
That is fainting under the rod. Both extremes rob the individual of the actual benefit of the trial. They both prevent the discipline from doing its surgical work.
So we need to carefully map out these two dangers so we know what they look like in everyday life. Let us break down that first danger, despising the rod. Spurgeon identifies 5 distinct ways we commit this error. We do not just do it one way. Human pride is very creative.
It really is.
I want to start with the most common one, the one that probably trips up almost everyone listening to this: complaining, or as the text calls it, murmuring.
Murmuring is the immediate involuntary reflex of a proud heart. Spurgeon compares the believer feeling the first blow of the rod to an unbroken colt. He references Ephraim in the Old Testament rearing up against the collar. Think about a wild horse that has never worn a harness. The first time the collar goes over its neck and it feels a restriction, the reaction is violent. It kicks, it rears up, it fights the restraint.
Because it believes it should be completely free to roam wherever it wants. It sees the collar as an enemy to be destroyed.
Right. And the first time a child of God feels the restriction or the sharp sting of a trial, the immediate reaction is to kick at it. The heart asks, why am I thus afflicted? What have I done to deserve this? This is entirely unfair.
And it does not just stop at questioning the fairness. We start looking around at everyone else. We look around with the eye of jealousy. We see our neighbors, our coworkers with less sorrow, more money, better health, and we think, that person is happier than I am. Why do they get a free pass while I am suffering?
We assume our condition is the worst possible scenario. We claim to be the most afflicted of all people. This murmuring is not necessarily spoken aloud in a defiant shout. It is often the quiet, cynical thought running constantly in the background of our minds. It is a slow leak of bitterness. And it ties directly into the second way we despise the rod, which is claiming the trial is of no use. We dismiss its value entirely.
This brings up what I would call the myth of good providence. Spurgeon really dissects our modern habit of how we use that word, and it exposes a lot of hypocrisy.
It is a brilliant observation. We generally only call good things a providence. Spurgeon gives a very practical example. He says, if your grandfather dies and leaves you 500 pounds, you look up and say, what a merciful providence. Or if you avoid a terrible carriage accident by mere seconds, you say it is a wonderful providence.
We attribute the good luck to God's careful sovereign planning.
Yes. But Spurgeon asks the uncomfortable question. Suppose you lose 500 pounds in a bad business deal. Is that not a providence? Suppose your business completely fails, or you actually do break your leg in the accident.
We suddenly stop using the word providence. We call it bad luck or an attack from the enemy or just a tragedy. We refuse to attach God's sovereign planning to the broken leg.
But if the one thing is ordered by God, so is the other. To say that a prosperous event is a brilliant providence, but an adverse event is useless, random, or purely destructive, is an act of sheer arrogance. It is a finite human mind standing up before the maker of the universe and telling him that his dispensations are unwise. It is telling the divine surgeon that his methods are wrong.
It is like telling the doctor that the scalpel is a useless tool just because it cuts the skin. You are completely ignoring the tumor the scalpel is trying to remove. I want to highlight 2 vivid examples Spurgeon gives here to help us visualize this concept of finding value in the pain. First, he brings up a historical practice regarding Roman slave emancipation.
Yes, in the ancient Roman world, when a master or an emperor decided to set a slave free, the ritual involved a physical strike. The emperor would strike the slave on the head, sometimes a rather hard blow, and simultaneously say, "Go free." That physical blow was the literal token of liberty. It was the legal marker of their emancipation.
Wait, they actually hit the slave, so the pain of the strike was the mechanism of release.
Right. It stung, but it meant freedom. If the slave complained about the headache, they were completely missing the point that they no longer wore chains.
Wow. So the pain was the receipt for freedom. It requires a massive shift in perspective. You have to look past the immediate sting of the strike and see the freedom it purchases.
And the second example is much more poetic. Spurgeon talks about the natural world to make his point. He says God brews light in the dark, he fashions diamonds in deep black mines, and he makes pearls in the dark beds of the sea.
It requires the darkness and the crushing pressure to create the immense value. If you remove the pressure, you just have a lump of coal.
Exactly.
But I want to push back on this murmuring point for a moment. This sounds very stoic. Isn't a groan just a natural human reflex to pain? If I am hammering a nail and I miss and hit my thumb, I am going to yell. If my heart gets broken, I am going to cry. At what point does a natural, involuntary ouch cross the line into the arrogant murmuring that Spurgeon is so strictly condemning? Are we not allowed to feel the pain?
That is a vital distinction, and we must not confuse the two. There is a massive difference between expressing grief and harboring a cynical, resentful spirit. The biblical texts are full of people expressing intense, agonizing grief. Look at the Psalms. Tears are entirely natural. A groan of physical or emotional pain is the body's natural response to trauma. God does not demand that we act like unfeeling robots when the rod strikes.
So the ouch is completely fine. The tears are fine.
Yes, the groan crosses the line into murmuring when it becomes an accusation. It is when the groan turns into a firm statement that God is cruel, unjust, or unwise. It is the prideful spirit that says, "I know better than the Creator how my life should be managed. I would have written a better script than this." It is a spirit that looks at the deep mine and says, "There is no diamond down here, only worthless dirt," refusing to trust the process.
So complaining and completely dismissing the usefulness of the trial are the first two ways we despise the rod. We kick against it and we say it's a waste of time. But complaining is not the only way we despise correction. Sometimes we despise it by being deeply embarrassed by it or by completely missing the point of why it was applied in the first place. Let us move to the second part of this danger, dishonor, deafness, and dismissing others. What is the third way we despise the rod?
The third way is thinking it is dishonorable to be persecuted or chastened. Spurgeon brings up the scenario of a young person in the workplace or society who faces mockery for their faith. Initially, they might bear it, but eventually they start to feel it as a disgrace. They feel a loss of respectability among their peers, and they begin to retreat. They hide their convictions. They despise the affliction because they view it as a mark of shame, a sign that they are losing status in the world.
To counter that feeling of embarrassment, Spurgeon unpacks this incredible analogy of the standard-bearer in ancient warfare. We need to explain what a standard-bearer was because it completely flips the script on what we consider honorable.
In ancient armies, the standard-bearer carried the heavy flag or the crest of the king into battle. The standard was the rallying point for the entire army. Now, the greatest honor for a veteran warrior was not to be placed on the safe, quiet edges of the skirmish where nothing was happening. The bravest fighters wanted to be in the absolute center, right where the standard was raised.
Because that is where the enemy concentrated all their fire. If you take down the standard, you break the morale of the army. So the enemy archers are aiming specifically at that spot.
Right. That is where the shafts flew the thickest. That is where the lances fell like hail. The warrior gloried in the fact that he was trusted by his king to stand in the hottest, most lethal part of the battle. He did not look at the arrows flying at his head and think, "The king hates me." He thought, "The king trusts me with the most critical position on the field."
It totally changes how you view opposition.
Yes.
If you are catching arrows, it means you are in the center of the field where it matters most.
Right?
It is a badge of absolute honor, not a mark of shame. You are not being pushed to the margins, you are being placed in the vanguard.
Which leads right into the fourth way we despise the rod, failing to amend our behavior. Spurgeon calls this the deaf soul.
The deaf soul. This is the person who gets the warning, feels the strike, but just puts their head down and keeps walking toward the cliff edge.
He references Eli from the Old Testament book of Samuel. God sent a severe warning to Eli about his failure to reprove his corrupt sons. The text says God gave a warning that would make his ears tingle. It was a sharp, clear rebuke. But Eli did not change his behavior. He kept on the exact same as ever. He heard the warning. He might have even felt bad about it for a moment, but he took no action.
Wow.
And because he ignored the gentle blow of the warning, a devastating, fatal blow came later. His sons were killed in battle, the ark was captured, and his chance to reform his house was permanently gone.
It is the absolute tragedy of an unsanctified trial, a trial that is entirely wasted because the person refused to listen. It brings up this highly relatable analogy of the stone in the shoe. We all know that specific feeling. You are walking along the sidewalk and you feel a sharp rock slip under your heel. But you are in a hurry. You have places to be. So instead of stopping, you just shift your weight slightly.
Yeah, we've all done that.
Right? You start walking with a strange limp to avoid putting pressure on the heel. You walk a mile, maybe 2 miles, in constant irritating pain simply because you will not stop, sit down, and take 5 seconds to take the shoe off and find the stone.
That is precisely what Spurgeon is getting at. Human busyness and pride keep us limping. Many people walk with a spiritual limp for years because they will not stop to find the hidden sin, the bad habit, or the error causing the pain. The chastisement, the pain in the heel, is meant to make you sit down and take off the shoe. It is designed to force a pause. If you just keep limping, you are despising the correction. You are ignoring the very reason the discomfort was sent in the first place. You are enduring the pain but refusing the cure.
He also shares a humorous anecdote in this section that I think perfectly captures how we should handle the stone once we find it. It is a story about a countryman who was being tormented by his past mistakes, the things he had done wrong. He felt the guilt weighing him down constantly.
Yes, the countryman finally got tired of the devil accusing him of all his past failures. So he told the devil that he had transferred all his business, bad debts and all, to Jesus Christ. He said, "I made a transfer of the whole concern to him. Go tell my master about them. Do not bother me." It is a rough, unpolished country way of saying it, but it captures the absolute freedom of justification.
It really does. It shows that taking the stone out of the shoe does not mean you have to wallow in the guilt of having had the stone in the first place. You address the failure, you confess it, you hand the bad debt over to the master who took on your liabilities in the courtroom, and you walk free. You do not let the enemy use your past failures to keep you in a perpetual state of torment. You deal with it and move forward.
That brings us to the fifth and final way we despise the rod, and this one stings quite a bit because it is so incredibly common in our communities. We despise the chastening of the Lord when we despise other people whom God is chastising. We judge the people who are suffering.
This is such a sharp observation. What does this look like in practice?
Spurgeon paints a picture of poor old Mrs. So-and-so, a bedridden woman who has been sick for years, or a man who comes to social gatherings always looking melancholy, always dealing with the gloomy side of things because of intense personal trials. The natural, unspoken reaction of the community is often to avoid them. People whisper, "It would be happy release if she passed away," which, frankly, often means a release for the people who have to spend time caring for her.
Oh, that's heavy.
Or they avoid the melancholy man because they prefer lighthearted, easy company. They do not want their fun afternoon ruined by someone else's heavy burdens.
I really want to zero in on this point. Why do we instinctively want to avoid people who are suffering? Is it just simple inconvenience, or is it something deeper? Is it because their affliction actually threatens our own sense of comfort and security?
It is absolutely a defense mechanism. Avoiding suffering people allows us to maintain an illusion of invulnerability. We prefer the amount of assurance, the sunny, cheerful spaces where everyone is healthy and wealthy. Sitting with someone in the dark valley of affliction requires us to confront our own fragility. It forces us to realize that we are just one phone call, one doctor's diagnosis, or one economic crash away from being in their exact shoes. That is a terrifying thought. So we push the suffering person away to push the thought away.
So by dismissing the person who is under the rod, we are trying to dismiss the reality of the rod itself. We are trying to pretend the sculptor's chisel does not exist.
Correct. But Spurgeon warns that if you think little of the people God is chastising, you are actively despising the God who chastens them. He notes that the most severely tried children of God often have the greatest wisdom to share. Beneath their mourning garments, they wear garments of light. If you avoid them because they make you uncomfortable, you miss the heavy lessons they have learned in the furnace. You miss the gold that was refined in the fire.
Okay, having thoroughly mapped this massive rock on the left side of the pass, the danger of despising the rod through pride, complaining, and avoidance, we have to steer the conversation to the whirlpool on the right side, the danger of fainting entirely. If despising the rod is an excess of arrogant pride, fainting is a complete structural collapse into despair.
Yes, and Spurgeon breaks down the specific ways people faint. The first way is by giving up all exertion. He uses the analogy of sulky children who refuse to do their chores because things did not go their way. They get a mild reprimand, and they just throw their hands up and quit entirely.
This is the person who faces a setback, loses their feeling of joy or success, and responds by just quitting everything. They resign from their volunteer positions, they stop engaging with their community, they stop trying to improve their situation. They just sit there, motionless, letting the world pass them by.
Spurgeon uses another great analogy from the agriculture and transportation of his day. He talks about a jibing shaft horse. In a team of horses pulling a heavy wagon, you have different positions. The shaft horse is the one positioned in the back, right against the wagon shafts. It is doing the heavy, unglamorous, grinding pulling. The horses up front, the lead horses, get to wear the ribbons. They are seen by everyone. They look majestic.
But the shaft horse is doing the real work.
Right. And some horses will refuse to pull. They jibe or balk unless they are placed at the front. If they cannot be in the prominent, comfortable position where everyone admires them, they will simply refuse to move. They will not do the work at all. Spurgeon also quotes an old saying, "I must be top sawyer, and I will not be at bottom to shove the saw up."
Meaning, if I am not the one standing on top of the log, in charge of the saw, and getting all the credit, I refuse to be the guy in the pit doing the sweaty work of pushing the blade back up. If I am not in charge or feeling great, I am out.
It is a form of spiritual sulkiness. God applies the rod. God removes them from a prominent position or places them in a difficult, unglamorous season of life. And instead of moving forward and doing the quiet work, the person just sits down in the mud and refuses to take another step.
Oh.
Yeah, and the second way people faint is even more internal. It is by doubting their relationship with God entirely. They feel the blow of the rod and immediately conclude, I must not be a child of God, or I would not be in this distress.
They misread the diagnostic chart. They read the trial as evidence of total rejection rather than evidence of parental correction. They think the presence of pain means the absence of love.
To counter this, Spurgeon recounts a historical story that is deeply arresting. It is about a minister named Richard Cecil and his friend, a man named Williams. Williams was a highly prosperous man, wildly successful in everything he did in business and life. Cecil, his pastor, was actually very worried about him because of this unbroken, continuous prosperity. He feared God had forgotten Williams.
Because he wasn't facing any chastisement. Everything was just too easy.
Right. Then, one day, Cecil calls on Williams at his home and finds the man weeping bitterly over a dying child. And Cecil's reaction is startling. He says to his grieving friend, "Thank God, I have been anxious about you. I was afraid my father had forgotten you, but I know he recollects you now."
We have to pause here. We have to really unpack this because this sounds incredibly jarring, almost monstrous to modern ears.
Yeah.
Walking into a room with a grieving father and a dying infant and saying, "Thank God."
Yeah, it's intense.
If someone did that today, they would be thrown out of the house and shunned by the community. How do we process that today without seeing Cecil as incredibly cruel?
It is shocking, and it is meant to be shocking. To process it, we have to grasp the heavy theological reality Cecil is operating under. In this framework, untouched, continuous prosperity is terrifying. It is terrifying because it implies abandonment. If a father lets a child run wild, do whatever they want, make terrible decisions, and never once corrects them, it is not a sign of love. It is a sign of complete neglect.
It makes me think of a parent who has just completely given up on a rebellious teenager. They just throw their hands in the air and say, "Do whatever you want. I do not care anymore. Ruin your life."
The lack of rules is actually the ultimate punishment.
Exactly. So for Cecil, seeing his friend finally experience a severe, heart-wrenching trial was tangible proof of divine adoption. It was proof of divine attention. He was not glad the child was suffering. He was relieved that his friend was not abandoned by God. The suffering was evidence that the Father was actively working in Williams's life, that the sculptor was still chipping away at the stone, refining him for eternity.
That reframes the entire concept of hardship. It makes the lack of hardship the thing to be feared. It suggests that if your life is perfectly smooth, you might be the unbroken colt that has just been turned out into the wilderness and left to its own devices. That is a chilling thought. And what is the third way people faint under the rod? The third way is fancying that one will never escape the trouble. The feeling of being permanently, hopelessly trapped. A person wrestles with a trial for months or years. Deliverance does not come on their timeline, and they conclude it never will. They give up all hope of ever seeing the sun again.
Spurgeon gives a couple of great mental strategies for this, right? He offers an antidote to feeling trapped in the dark.
He uses the image of a man lost in a massive dark wood. If you are wandering in a forest and you cannot see your way out, what do? You do not just sit down against a stump and wait to die. You climb the highest tree you can find to get a vantage point, to look over the canopy and see the sweet fields beyond the edge of the forest. He says we should climb a promise like a tall tree. Get above the immediate darkness of your current situation to see the broader landscape of what has been guaranteed to you in the future.
You elevate your perspective above the immediate pain. And if you cannot climb, what if you were too exhausted to climb the tree?
Then you act like Samson in the book of Judges. When Samson was blind and mocked, he grasped the massive pillars of his affliction and pulled the whole house down around the heads of his enemies. Spurgeon says we should grasp the pillars of our trials and use them to pull down our own sins. You take aggressive action against the despair. You do not just sit passively under it.
It is about active endurance. Recognizing that the fetters on your hands might be too strong for your fingers to break, but they are absolutely nothing against the hammer of providence. You trust that the same hand that applied the rod will eventually break the chains. So, we have steered past the rock of despising the rod and the whirlpool of fainting under it. But if you are listening to this, and you still feel singled out by your suffering, like you are the only one catching this intense, relentless discipline, Spurgeon has one final rhetorical flourish. He wants to prove that you are in very good company. Let us look at the universal brotherhood of the rod.
Spurgeon initiates this grand roll call across history. He asks the listener to look back at the heroes of the faith and see if they can find a single prophet who is not chastened. He lists Abraham, who had to wait decades for a son and then was asked to sacrifice him. He lists Daniel, thrown into a den of lions, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Malachi, all faced intense persecution, depression, and physical suffering.
He asks if there is a single king among the chosen who escaped. Even the greatest monarchs faced the rod.
David is the prime example. He was the great king, but he had to cross the brook Kidron in darkness, weeping, fleeing for his life from his own rebellious son. Hezekiah, another faithful king, had to take the terrifying, threatening letter from the massive invading Assyrian army and spread it before the Lord in desperation.
It is a shared language of pain. There is not a single hero in the text who had an easy, comfortable ride.
And then he points to the highest example, the Son of God himself. He bore the cross. He endured the curse. He suffered 10,000-fold more chastisement than anyone else could possibly endure. Spurgeon concludes with this sweeping statement. He says there is not one soul in heaven who lived past infancy, whose back is unscarred by this rod.
Suffering is the universal entry requirement. It is the shared language of the saints. If you are hurting, you are not an outcast. You are walking the exact same dirt path that every prophet, king, and savior walked before you. But what about those who do not share this faith? What about the person listening who thinks this is all just religious coping? Spurgeon directs a closing argument at the secularist.
He asks a very practical, penetrating question. Where do people without this framework get their comfort when the glass is empty? It is easy to be happy when the board is covered with food, your health is perfect, and hilarity is in the air. The secular philosophy works fine on a sunny afternoon. But what happens when health departs, wealth vanishes, and death approaches? What sustains the mind then?
He makes a really bold claim here. He says that even if we were to die like dogs with no afterlife, this faith is worth having for this life alone. I want to ask you about that. Is Spurgeon saying that this framework for suffering is practically superior, purely as a mental survival tool, to anything the secular world offers?
He is confirming exactly that. Look at the mechanics of it. If you treat suffering as random, meaningless cruelty from an indifferent, cold universe, it crushes you.
Yeah.
It breeds pure nihilism. You suffer, and there's no reason for it, so you just despair. But treating suffering as an intentional, loving tool used by a father for your ultimate good turns heavy burdens into feathers. It gives you a mechanism to extract value from pain.
You find light in the depth of darkness. You find a diamond in the crushing pressure.
Yes. Having a framework that forces you to look for the profit in the pain is a psychological and spiritual advantage that no amount of worldly wealth or secular philosophy can replicate. It prevents the despair that leads to ruin. It makes you resilient in a way that sheer willpower never could, because your resilience is based on the purpose of the trial, not just your own grit.
That brings us to the end of our analysis of this striking 1855 text. I want to thank you for guiding us through the theology and the psychology behind these concepts. It really does rewrite the diagnostic manual for human suffering.
My pleasure. It is a text that challenges our deepest assumptions about comfort, correction, and what it means to be loved.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on. We covered a massive amount of ground today, But there is one tiny detail from Spurgeon's roll call that we barely touched on, and it holds a stunning implication. When Spurgeon lists all the saints in heaven with scarred backs, he makes one single exception: the infant. He notes that only the infant who dies young escapes the rod, flying straight to heaven without scars. If you think about the logic there, it suggests something massive about the nature of our lives. It suggests that the very definition of earthly time is chastisement time. The only way to avoid the rod is to not live a full life on this earth. Therefore, what if you stopped waiting for a season of life where the discipline finally stops? What if, instead of viewing a pain-free life as the baseline and hardship as an annoying interruption, you accepted that the sculptor's chisel will be chipping away at the stone for as long as you have breath in your lungs? How would accepting that reality shift the way you wake up tomorrow morning? Keep your eyes open, watch your steps, and keep thinking.